Now it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague Bjorn Stensaker, who's a professor of higher education and the current Vice Rector for Education at the University of Oslo. He has a special research interest related to policy reform, governance and organizational change in higher education, so I would say a perfect speaker for today's theme. He has published widely on these issues in a range of international journals and book series. Recently, he has published research on internationalization and globalization in higher education, reflection in historical paths, current perspectives and future possibilities, and also on strategic advisory boards, the emergence of shadow governance in universities, and that's a question, and I think he will discuss some of these and other issues because he's going to tell us about changes in autonomy and governance in European higher education. So we move to the US, to Europe now.
Thank you. Of course, the topic of my presentation is university board. I've been asked by Alberto to focus on this because I think this is a very special development that we see in Europe. And I will try to provide you with a little bit of overview on that. Does it work? Ah, fantastic. It does. But before I dive into the specifics of university boards, I would like to pay a little attention also to some of the topics that David was talking about, the changes that we see take place when it comes to governance in general, and perhaps also pointing out some European developments in that area. I know that there will be others after me also addressing this, so hopefully we can create more of a comprehensive picture as we go along during the day. But I think the pattern, and there's been a lot of studies on changes in European governance, and this is just one example of some of these changes that we have seen in various countries. And of course there are variations. Europe is diverse, so there is variation among European countries. But we do see that there are at least some clear patterns here with the replacement of what you could call democratic councils, collegial councils, more and we've seen executive boards appearing as a consequence. We see a trend also for more formal external involvement in university governance. That's a clear trend in many countries. People from outside the universities have entered into governance positions in the boards. We could see, as David also pointed out, what you could call centralization of formal decision-making power, meaning that the vertical dimensions of our universities have become stronger. So the link between the top institutional leadership and what's going on at the shop floor, it's also more connected than in the past. And of course you could see a trend from a more collective orientation into institutional leaders becoming more powerful, partly due also to the centralization. So there is an overlap here between the centralization and the more individualistic responsibility and power that you could find here. I would argue that this development that we see here is not only a type of US imitation. I think a lot of the reform tendencies that we have seen in Europe is also partly related to domestic reform attempts or in public sector in general, where the inspiration is not US research universities but private companies. So if we can talk about the new public management effect in Europe, we see that the inspiration from private companies and private business has been a key driver for some of the changes that has gone on in the public sector in general, including universities. And as a result here, what we can see is that the number of stakeholders involved in university governance have really increased. But it is to be noticed that, that the existing stakeholders that we're in, students, for example, they haven't been moving out of, or pushed out of the governance, but new stakeholder groups have been included in the governance, making basically the governance more complex, with much more stakeholder voices coming into the governance of the institutions. And of course, in Europe, you could argue, and David paid a visit to the 1960s and student uprise and demonstrations. And in Europe, that was kind of dramatic. So what we see playing out now is there is a long historical backdrop here. So the European universities used to be very collegiate in their internal governance, but in the 1960s, in many countries, we saw that student representation was basically included. So, and also non-academic staff were included in the university governance. So that already took place in the 1960s and 1970s, and the changes that we've seen with a more external representation can be seen as part of a continuous process here. That being said, I think these formal national reforms, the ambitions are not necessarily what is implemented in practice at the institutional level. So we see that a number of institutions, well, they still keep old forms of governance while adapting to new ones. So we have in Europe, I think, plenty of examples of collegiate bodies still in place in some of these universities, at least with some veto power. So they can actually say no to proposals coming from the institutional leadership. They can veto some attempts of for example, when it comes to budget or when it comes to academic promotions and stuff like that. So the democratic representation is still very noticeable, despite the changes that we have seen when it comes to the legal, in the legal area. But I think that the result is more hybridity. It is more complexity and more layering of new governance arrangements on top of the existing ones. And that, of course, can be a challenge. I also would like to say that when we look at changes in governance, it is important to acknowledge that universities are also dynamic organizations. They change not only as a consequence of changes in governance, but they also change in itself. They are dynamic organizations. And they are reflected by a lot of the changes that take place in societies. There's been, again, a lot of research arguing that European universities have now become more complete organizations. Complete organizations in the sense that they resemble how an organization looks like, also in textbooks, right? And what we have seen taking place, some of the developments that we have seen taking place in Europe at least, is kind of an interesting development when it comes to how universities are run as organizations. We see an incredible professionalization of the administrative, especially staff in universities. We used to have secretaries at universities. Now we don't have secretaries. We have special advisors. We have people with PhDs working in administrative positions that really also drive this kind of both professionalization, but also an increased specialization in university administration. And we can see that there are new functions being picked up by universities. Universities, for example, 20, 30 years ago, we didn't have communication departments. Maybe we had a person providing some information from time to time, but now we have professionalized communication departments. We've seen in the US that universities are expanding their legal departments. You know, they are being sued all the time, but there are also other reasons for why they are expanding this area of administration. In Europe, we see that more and more universities are developing specialized units for EU research funding, for example. So we see that there is an immense driver here for internal changes that is not only related to the governance changes, but that take place in parallel with some of these developments. And we can also see how outside agencies sometimes penetrate our universities and contribute to take away the power of the institutional leadership. I think a noticeable example is, for example, in quality assurance, where all universities these days, they have quality assurance units that are working and that are in close contact with the national quality assurance agencies, developing some kind of professional bond between those that are working with quality assurance inside the university and those that are working with quality assurance, for example, at the national level. So our organizations are also being penetrated by outside agencies. So one could argue, as Peter Marson and myself has been trying to state in this article back from 2019, that universities, they used to be labeled in the 1970s as organized anarchies, bottom-heavy organizations. They are loosely coupled. And what are we seeing now? Are we seeing them developed as complete organizations? Yes, in a sense, I can understand that, but you could also argue, as we do in this article, that universities also these days are more, they are starting to look like decoupled bureaucracies. Because there is, yes, we do see a strengthened vertical integration of universities, but we also see that the horizontal coordination between all these specialized, professionalized silos in the universities, it is very difficult. It is very difficult to actually to integrate it. Let's then dive into, with this as a backdrop, let's dive into to university boards. And I would like to start with a more, theoretical positioning about what could be possible roles and functions of university boards. What are possible implications? I've listed 6 possible implications here. There could be more. This is not an exhaustive list, but I think these 6 points address some possible functions at least. Of course, you could argue that with external representation, university boards are also there to make sure that national political ambitions are being realized. And of course, you could argue that the reason for this is that in many countries, not all countries, but in many countries, you could see that some of the external members of the university boards, they are now appointed by the government. I sit in a board in Sweden for a Swedish higher education institutions, and I'm appointed by the minister. That was the only thing I was, I received a very nice letter from the minister saying that you are now appointed, and I've not heard from him since. So I'm not quite sure whether I'm there to realize political ambitions, but you could argue that in some system that kind of appointment procedure could open up for that kind of influence. The second point here relates to a more traditional role for the board, right? That the board is responsible for shaping the institutional vision and mission. That would also relate well to the more ideas of a board in private sector companies, that they are really responsible for the owner's interest, and they should make sure that there is a good development of the organization. And of course you could, as David also pointed out in his presentation, that you could also argue that one of the duties of the board could be to shield the university from illegitimate outside pressure, especially from policy, but also from other types of societal stakeholders. And I think the case you mentioned, the example you mentioned about this system now coming under pressure in the US is something that we also need to take care of, need to notice also in Europe. And I think we have seen examples of that also in the European context. At the same time, there has also been, you could argue that by having so many different stakeholder groups in the board, you will also be able to link the board and the university more and embed the university more into the society, which is something that politicians, but also many other has had high on the agenda for many years. Of course, the problem with having all these stakeholders coming into the board is also that it could, in principle, open up for more internal conflicts between the different stakeholder groups, so that the board could be reduced to an arena for interest articulation, so that the academics, they are focusing very much on their rights and responsibilities. The students will just focus on what's good for the students, and the external representatives will just focus what's good for the society. So there you could have a board which could be much more fragmented and not really being this powerful driver of the institutional vision and mission. In that situation, if that is to be the case, in that situation you could also argue that the board being composed of so many different stakeholder groups, well, that could also be a very easy board to manipulate for a much stronger institutional leadership, where different stakeholder groups could be played out against each other. So sometimes you have an alliance between the academics and the students, and sometimes you have an alliance between the students and external representatives. So it's easier to manipulate some of the developments that are taking place. So these are the possible functions of a board. Let's now have a look into some of the empirical studies that have been undertaken on this. If we start by a study conducted by the EUA, the European University Association, from 2018. They had this mapping of board characteristics in Europe, and they also found that some of the things that I've been talking about already, that external representation has become a key characteristics. Although we need to notice that the share of the external representatives at the total member of the board is still varying to a lot of in many instances. In some boards, external members are making up the whole board. In some countries, external representatives are making up a majority. And in other countries, you also see that external members are making up a minority of board representatives. But again, they also found that none have been kicked out, so students are still there, and they have been there for a long time. Non-academic staff is there in many systems. But again, the picture is not really, the trend is not so clear. In many countries, we still see that there is this dual type of governance structure in place still, where you still have kept the old Senate, and it's similar a bit to the system that David provided in the US, where you have you have a board, one part of the governance structure is more focused on the funding and the economy, and the Senate is much more focusing on academic issues and quality issues, so to speak. But we also see a lot of variation in board size, and this depends a little bit on national regulations and institutional autonomy. And I think in Portugal you have boards that can be from 15 to 35 members, and 35 members, that's a huge board in a European setting. I think the normal is to have boards that are closer or less than 15, I would argue. If we then have a look at some of the studies that have been conducted here. So again, especially also if we go back to the US and look into, because some of the studies have been conducted also in the US context, you could see that this external representation can sometimes also mean strengthened corporate influence inside universities. But other studies, especially from Europe, point out that, well, it's not only private sector people that tend to come into these kind of positions. We can also find people from the civic sector, also from many public organizations coming in here. So it's not the picture, at least in Europe. There we see that there is a much broader representation. It's not only private sector, there is a much larger share of people coming in from public and civic organizations altogether. In the US, I think we've seen, and these relates to some of the studies that our colleague Sheila Slaughter has done on academic capitalism, where we can notice that in some universities, and also talking about the biological revolution, that big tech and big pharma has come into some of these boards and creating perhaps some unhealthy links between some private companies and the research that is conducted in some universities. Who are these people? Who are the people that are occupying the positions in these boards? When I started out, I talked about this representation that started out in the 1960s, that students and also non-academic staff came into the governance of higher education institutions. And lately we have seen more stakeholder groups coming in. So yes, there is a shift from representation to stakeholder groups in that sense. But what is also very interesting, I would argue, is that there are some personal characteristics here. They are elite people. It's not the common man and woman that is selected for these kind of positions. We can see an overrepresentation of CEOs. We can see an overrepresentation of leaders of civic organizations. We can see an overrepresentation of so-called distinguished professors also occupying these positions. And also coming back to the US, we can also find some examples that there's been some really unhealthy links to, for example, also the finance industry, going back to this academic capitalism perspective that Sheila Slaughter has developed. Interestingly, again, coming back to Europe, we can see evidence from some countries where the direct political representation actually has been reduced. It's not totally absent, but while it was common in let's say 20 years ago to have ex-politicians coming in, taking up positions in some of these boards, it is actually more rare today. They have been replaced by the CEOs of public and private and civic companies. Of course, in more regional-oriented universities, you will still find a lot of ex-politicians and politicians from the region because of the embedding of that particular organization, perhaps. So are there particular characteristics then when it comes to board performance? What makes a board effective? Of course, this is extremely difficult to measure in objective terms. What is the bottom line that you're supposed to measure? So the studies here, they often refer to whether the university is effective, also when it comes to attracting revenue or for student dropout, student success, stuff like that. So what have we found here from studies? Well, larger boards that actually contain a number of stakeholders from different organizations and interests tend to be associated with better performance. And this is a classic insight from these studies. Of course, performance, especially in the US context, can also be related to whether the board and the organization is effective in attracting donations, in attracting private donations linked to alumni and stuff like that. We also see from research that it is super important with clear internal regulations. And that means that there are very strict conflict of interest rules, that the board is really independent, that there is a nomination committee for board selection, so that the board is not reappointing themselves, but that there is proper mechanisms for ensuring that there is merit, that there are merit-based selection processes in place. And of course, we sometimes find a lot of studies that emphasize that, yes, you could organize this as much as you want. At the end of the day, it boils down also to some of the personal relationships that you have between the board chairman and the rector or the vice president. There is a need for a personal relationship. There is a need for some kind of trust between these two key roles. From a more organizational point of view, we have seen research also showing that boards these days, they have to address a lot of issues. They are responsible for economy, for various accountability measures, reporting, and so. So the board agendas and are actually important. And there is a danger that if you have board agendas that are dominating by how can I put it, the practicalities of just running the organization, then there is a danger that the board will not have time actually to dive into and pay attention to more strategic processes, reducing the strategic capacity of the board altogether. So this process of trying to knit these different stakeholders together into some kind of community, providing a sense of we're in it together, that is something that has been identified as really crucial for the success and performance of a board. And I think there's been studies also showing then that a lot of the board members, they are claiming that the most important meetings they have is not the formal meetings where they come together to make decisions. It is the informal meetings where they go to, where they have a weekend, where they spend together, where they talk together more informally, trying to find common ground on difficult issues, where they have this informal opportunity to talk together. Those are the important arenas for long-term development, and to be able to actually make sure that you have these kind of informal settings, that is very crucial also for board performance. Let me also take a short visit into a study I was part of, because in Norway, we have the possibility, universities have the possibilities to choose between two different governance arrangements. The first governance arrangement is the traditional one. And in Norway, since the establishment of University of Oslo, the first university in Oslo, in Norway, there is the tradition that the rector, and the rector is elected by academic staff, is also the chairman of the board. So the rector has a dual position, being the rector in the daily life and also being the chairman of the board. And the board in Norway also consists of external representatives of academic staff and students, but no one is in majority. So the board consists of 11 people, with the chairman being the number 11, and then you have 4 external representatives, you have 4 academics, and you have 2 students. So you could have different constellations here in the board. So that is one of the models. The second model is if the university board decide that they want to have an external chairman. Then one of the external members become the chairman. Then the rector also is not part of the board anymore, but is appointed and selected by the board, which is a different type of a governance model that we recognize from private sector companies, right? You have an external chairman, and you have a director that is hired by the board and can be sacked by the board. So these are the 2 models that we have in Norway. So in many ways, Norway, it was a natural experiment. So what we did was to study 4 universities having the model with an external chairman, and then we have 4 universities with the rector also as chairman of the board. So we had in-depth, this was a qualitative study where we really tried to see, okay, are they working differently with these two setups? And the short answer is no, not really. They are actually very similar when it comes to how they operate in their daily practice. And one of the reasons for that, we argued, is that, well, of course, higher education in Norway, that's a public responsibility. So the ministry, they basically set the rules of the game. So it doesn't matter what kind of internal governance model you have at the university. There is a national model. There is a national funding model. There is a national model for quality assurance. There are national models for everything. So yes, you have autonomy. Of course you have autonomy, but at the same time you are embedded into the national governance system, taking away a little bit of or quite a lot of the room to maneuver, so to speak, for the university leadership. And also what we found in this study, which was also kind of interesting, because you would expect that in a model where you have an external chairman, and a chairman that has also hired the rector, basically, you would expect that the external chairman would be much more controlling, taking up a controlling function of the rector, making sure that the rector is doing his or her job, right? What we found was that because the chairman appointed the rector, there is also some kind of interesting bond developing, because the chairman doesn't want to recognize that he or she has done a failure appointing the wrong person. right? So you have this interesting dynamic also playing out, so that there is a joint sense of destiny. Okay, I appointed this person. I make sure I need to make his or her a success, right? So you have an interesting dynamic there, also playing down the possible control function that you would expect from this formal setup. And again, I think we also saw that these agendas, they are pretty much pretty similar, regardless of what kind of model that you end up with. So also what we have discovered in Europe is that, yes, you have seen these changes when it comes to the board composition, external representation, much more hierarchy, but at the same time, we have seen also that these boards, they don't have that kind of insight into what actually goes on at the shop floor level. Yes, they are developing fancy strategies up there. Yeah, interesting. But do they really have a sense of knowledge of what goes on at the shop floor level? So yes, you see changes going on at the top level, but you could question whether they are actually decoupled a little bit from core activities, both in research but also in education. Let me also share with you another piece of research I've been involved in, which I also think is interesting. And that is a development where we see that, yes, if we study the formal changes that goes on in university governance, yes, there is this trend toward more private type of company type of design. At the same time, we've seen during the last decade a number of so-called strategic advisory boards popping up at various institutions throughout Europe, but also in Asia. And these are informal boards appointed by the institutions themselves, often the institutional leadership that takes responsibility for that. And of course you could, and I've been on some of these myself, so I've first-hand experience, but this study was actually based on a number of interviews with people occupying these kind of positions. These strategic advisory boards, they can have different functions. Sometimes they are just a branding exercise, because institutions, they want to have big names so that they can show that they are international and what have you. Sometimes these advisory boards are used as lobbyists for various purposes, but sometimes they're also used to develop more academic strategies for the institution. And if they have that kind of function, I think they are very interesting as an alternative type of governance, a shadow governance, where you could see and you could argue that some older characteristics of the collegiate type of governance steering is coming back to us in different formats, like a more controlled collegiality, because it is the leadership that select these kind of people that sits on these strategic advisory boards. But it is still collegiate, and they have very much focus on academic issues. So what we see here is that, yes, we can focus on the formal side of the governance of universities, but there is an informal, there is a more practical side to this that we also need to pay attention to if we are to understand how universities actually functions these days. Let me start to round up. I think what we have seen from the research here is, yes, there is surely a trend toward more external representation in boards in Europe. But I would be very careful. I would be very careful by arguing that this is just the corporatization of universities. we could still see that representation is still very dominant, but there is a different kind of representation where it's not only private sector companies that are coming in here, but also representatives from public organizations, from civic organizations, and from the larger society. So again, I would argue that the inspiration is not so much the US, but it's more generic public sector reforms that has influenced how European universities have ended up with these kind of constructions. Whether they are good or bad, that's up for discussion. But I think that's an important driving force that we have seen. What I think is important here is that this focus on external influence, and we see a lot of them. I think in various countries we have academics claiming that, oh, this is new public management and this is awful and this is a very bad development. At the same time, you know, what I've been trying to argue here is that, well, it's not so public management after all, it's not so corporate after all. It's a different kind of governance. But one of the downsides here is that what we see is that the board may become even more decoupled from the core functions of universities than perhaps we would like it to be. So in that sense, you could argue that these new boards, they can also, maybe they don't have that much impact over the core activities of universities that we think they are. Of course, they could have it if they are really proactive and really want to, but I'm questioning whether they, in fact, are that influential in practice. So I think when we are discussing these questions, it's very important that we try to provide, that we also try to see the larger context. That when we analyze governance in higher education, that we are not only focusing on what's going on at the institutional level, but we need to pay attention also on the system kind of effects of these kind of steering arrangements. And I think that there is a danger here that some of the things that, for example, national authorities would like to see, you know, when it comes to, okay, how can we create a very nice higher education system? For example, in Portugal, where you have a division of labor, where you have a system that is flexible enough to cater for the different needs of the society. How are that kind how is that agenda? How can that be reflected in the governance of the universities? How can we make sure that universities actually are playing a role in the overarching system and not only solo players in a very decentralized system? So I think this is one of the most important issues that we need to dive into also when it comes to future research. I don't have the answer right now, but I think this would be super interesting to study also in the future. Thank you.